Long before Europeans venture out into the waters of the Atlantic to see what lay beyond the boundaries of their continent, tribes of Native Americans inhabited the land we now know as North America.
North America and South America are the last two continents that are in the temperate and tropical zones that received human inhabitation. And as far as we can tell, the first people to come into the continent came via northeastern Asia, and they came at some point between about 15 and 12,000 years ago. But the archaeology that we rely upon to make those statements is in a state of flux. And there are some people who suggest that the occupation may have begun as long ago as 30,000 years ago.
The elders tell us this is the first history. And the first history occurred when the plants and the animals came into being, when the creative forces moved upon the earth, when the positive and negative forces influenced what we know as human beings today.
The Paleo-Indians, who were the first people to colonize the Americas, were a hunting and gathering people, and they apparently operated in relatively small bands, probably in the vicinity of 50 to 200 people, in which they would mostly be united by kinship. And at the period that they were coming into the Americas, there were very large herds of very large mammals, such as woolly mammoths and mastodons and giant bison. And so from a hunter's perspective, it was a paradise.
At first, the animals and plants of the land provided the sustenance necessary for survival.
For 99% of human history, people have hunted and gathered. And that was the tried and the true. That work, that was sustainable. People could move over vast territories. They took from those territories in an extremely light and extensive way. Agriculture was an entire revolution in the relationship of people to land. If you place human evolution equal to a day, say the last 3 million years equal to a day, agriculture has taken up about the last 4.5 minutes before midnight.
It really only takes hold in America north of the Rio Grande after about 500 AD and spreads into the American Northeast between about 1000 and 1200 AD. The form of agriculture in North America is raising corn, also varieties of beans and squash. And so it is not the classic European grains such as wheat, or rye, or barley, and there is not the raising of cattle and horses and pigs and sheep. None of these animals were part of the development of agriculture in North America.
You'd be astonished at the amount of remnants there are of these older agricultural civilizations that existed around here, with very elaborate social organization, ritual development, development of a great deal of crafts and agriculture, which exist before Europeans come there.
As groups of people moved across the land and adapted to different environments, they began to distinguish themselves, one group from another.
In the range of their movements, encouraged the proliferation of different languages, so that we have quite an array, somewhere in the vicinity of 375 different languages spoken in North America.
Among the Choctaws, for example, they believed they moved across the American West in an easterly direction, a southeasterly direction, and they were directed by a staff that the leaders would put into the earth every day. And then it would lean in a particular direction, and then in the morning they would follow that direction.
But there continues to be long-distance trade among the native peoples, so that we find goods traveling over half of North America. We can find minerals that were originally extracted from quarries in the Midwest and graves in the American Northeast. So there continue to be exchanges of these objects, primarily in the forms of gifts that manage to seal relationships between neighboring peoples.
For centuries, these neighboring peoples, the tribes and nations of the North and South, are relatively free of outside interference. This is not the situation on the other side of the Atlantic.
Well, in the early 15th century, Europe was a patchwork of small kingdoms and principalities. They were in competition with the Muslim peoples, who were very much expanding during the 14th and 15th centuries. And most notably in 1453, they captured the great Greek Christian city of Constantinople, which provided the Turkish Empire then with entree to invade into southeastern Europe. So the expansion of Europe, in many ways you could say, is kind of a surprise, given that they'd been on the retreat. On the other hand, they have a powerful incentive to try to find some way to get around Muslim power. And this led some enterprising mariners, Italian and from Spain and Portugal, to start to cast about ways to sail around Africa, to try to get to the trade goods of Asia in order to enrich their economies and enrich themselves. And then one of these mariners, the most visionary of all, Christopher Columbus, thought, why not just sail due westward, given their understanding that the world was round? And he went around seeking patrons who would support the test of this theory.
After failing to win support from Portugal, Europe's leading maritime power, Columbus turns to Queen Isabella of Spain. She and her husband Ferdinand, eager to gain recognition for their young monarchy, agree to support his plan.
I left the city of Granada on Saturday, the 12th day of May, 1492, and proceeded to Palos, a seaport where I armed 3 vessels very fit for such an enterprise. And having provided myself with stores and seamen, I set sail from the port on Friday, the 3rd of August, half an hour before sunrise, and steered for the Canary Islands. Sailed this day 19 leagues, and determined to count less than the true number, that the crew might not be dismayed if the voyage should prove long. At sunset, Martin Alonso called out with great joy from his vessel that he saw land, and demanded of the admiral a reward for his intelligence. Continued their course west till the afternoon, then southwest, and discovered that what they had taken for land was nothing but clouds. Encountered a heavier sea than they had met with before in the whole voyage. The crew in the Pinta saw a cane and a log. They also picked up a stick which appeared to have been carved with an iron tool. The crew of the Nina saw other signs of land and a stalk loaded with roseberries. The admiral directed them to keep a strict watch upon the forecastle and look out diligently for land, and to him who should first discover it he promised a silken jacket, besides the reward which the king and queen had offered. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the land was discovered at 2 leagues' distance.
It was a good thing that they made it when they did. They were getting low on water. They'd been out for a little over 30 days. But of course, it wasn't China or Japan that they reached. They were islands in the West Indies off the coast of North and South America. Indeed, Columbus went to his grave thinking that these islands were very close to China and Japan.
In time, Spanish explorers stopped thinking of the Americas as simply an obstacle en route to Asia. They see it as a potential source of wealth, even greater than their original destination. In fact, except for a portion of South America now known as Brazil, they claim the entire New World for Spain and begin the process of colonization and subjugation.
The Spanish monarchs really didn't have the capacity to fund and direct their own military expeditions, especially on the other side of the Atlantic. They were very dependent upon farming out these operations to essentially private entrepreneurs, military entrepreneurs. So an enterprising gentleman, somebody of military ability and of great ambition, would lobby the crown and try to get a license as an adelantado, which meant that he had the king's permission to go off in some part of the world, seek out other people, conquer them, and benefit from tribute taken from them. but any people conquered would then become part of the Spanish Empire, and the king would receive a share of the plunder and future taxes. And so for the monarchs, this is a low-risk strategy. They don't have much in the way of money. They don't have much in the way of a bureaucracy to manage large expeditions. And it encourages these ambitious young aristocrats who otherwise might be making trouble at home.
Cortez, who was probably the most famous, most successful of the conquistadors, said that the Spanish suffered from a disease of the heart that only gold could cure. And that's a far more complicated statement than it appears at first, because it's not just we want money, we want gold, but gold for the 16th century was a point of entry, was an entree into much greater forms of social independence. You could buy land, you could buy status of a certain kind, you could be a gentleman. And that would free you in all kinds of ways.
What surprised them, of course, was the high civilizations they did encounter in the Western Hemisphere, because the first major one they hit were the Aztecs, and later the Mayas, and later, of course, the Incas and Chibchas, and all kinds of others. And I think ultimately they were rather dazzled by many of these high civilizations.
These great towns and shrines and buildings, rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, never seen, and never dreamed of before.
And yet, as the conquistadors carve a path across the countryside, they bring destruction to each of the civilizations they encounter.
They are in there to get rich quick, to conquer Indians, subdue them, plunder them. And in the course of doing this, they, of course, are going to kill a great number of Indians and destroy a great number of Indian towns.
Without warning, the Spanish attacked, slashing at their hands and faces until they had killed all of them. This slaughter in the sacred patio went on for 3 hours. Then the Spaniards burst into the rooms of the temple to kill the others, those who were carrying water, or bringing fodder for the horses, or grinding meal, or sweeping the floor. After night fell, about 10 o'clock, a terrifying mob of women appeared, carrying torches. They came for their husbands and relatives who lay dead in the porticos. And as the women recognized the men, they threw themselves upon them with great sorrow and grief, and raised such a wailing and crying that it filled one with fear.
No one has the figures of how many people died. We only know through the emotions of those oral histories, and they just cry out to us about how horrible it was to watch the people around you die.
The loss of a lot of Indian lives and the destruction of a lot of Indian towns is not in the long-term interest of the Spanish monarch, who wants these people to be taxpayers, and he wants them to convert to Christianity. And their destruction doesn't work to that end. So the Spanish monarch wants to use the conquistadors, but then wants to put them on as short a leash as he can keep them on. And that interest coincides with that of Franciscan missionaries. They are totally dedicated to their mission, which is spreading Christianity. And they're appalled by the violence of the conquistadors. And so they're often lobbying the king to reduce the power of the conquistadors and increase the power of the Franciscan missionaries over these colonial enterprises.
There is an extremely strong religious motivation connected to the Spanish colonization, the missionary effort, all the missionaries who come over. And the Spanish crown itself is, and the Spanish state, is very much tied to the papacy and to a sense of its own religious purpose.
In the native experience, the Franciscans are not always pleasant people to take into their midst. Native peoples who are reeling from conquistador violence often feel they don't have any choice, that they can make the best of a bad situation by accepting Franciscan missionaries in as protectors. But it's always a bargain with many prices that Native people must pay.
The idea was to destroy the religions that they encountered and impose Catholicism upon those whom they met. The way it really turned out was that the Catholics soon found that the best way to get converts was to work out blends of Catholicism, which is why you find in Catholicism in different parts of Latin America to be so different, because of the varying Indian influences on the Catholicism. In terms of the governmental structures, of course, they wanted to destroy the major governmental structures, the ones that stood in the way of their conquest. On the other hand, to the degree that they could allow localized government systems to continue to operate as long as they played ball with the new Spanish rulers.
In conquering the Aztecs, the Spanish put themselves at the head of a system in which taking Indian labor was already part of the system. But when the Spanish go to places far from the Valley of Mexico, when they move even beyond New Mexico or into California or onto the Great Plains, they don't find those same kind of Indian peoples in place, and they find it very difficult to import the kind of relations that may work in Mexico or the Andes to those places. So they have to learn to adapt.
Hope sprang eternal that there were lots of Aztec empires and Inca empires, and it's this hope that inspires other Spanish conquistadors to probe northward from Mexico into what is now Florida and Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, even along the coast of California, looking for other rich empires. The other and more tangible and immediate incentive is that the Spanish plantations of the Caribbean islands needed labor. The native peoples that they had initially dragooned into doing the work on these plantations, and also mines, were dying out from their exposure to European diseases and from the stresses of slavery.
The earliest Europeans to make contact with the African continent and to begin to bring black people into predominantly white communities as lifetime workers or slaves were the Spanish and the Portuguese. And they're doing this in the 15th and 16th centuries. They may even have been doing it earlier than that. They will initially even bring a few of these workers to Europe. So on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, there is a pattern of black slavery before these nations lead the rest of the European countries in the conquest and resettlement of what we now call North and South America, West Indies, of course, included. You know, simply put, it's the great labor needs that these Europeans, who are in a very dynamic and exciting expansionist phase, they need laborers to help them develop and open up this territory and to make it economically feasible to do all of this settlement.
So to get more slaves, some of these expeditions proceeded along the coast of North America to Florida and the Carolinas to grab people, to haul them back and put them into slavery, to sell them as slaves. And so someone like Ponce de Leon, rather than looking for the fabled Fountain of Youth, was looking for slaves.
During this period, a third group also enters the scene: Spanish settlers.
They're artisans, they're farmers, they're lawyers, they're government officials, and they come in and they want a share of the riches of the Americas. So there ends up being a very heated competition between the secular colonists and the missionaries, who have a common goal of exploiting Indians, but have quite different ways of doing so.
And that really the only European settlements that succeed in this area for a very, very long time are what I call vampire settlements, because it's Europeans attach themselves to a settled Indian community, such as the Pueblos in New Mexico, and basically live off of Pueblo labor and Pueblo resources. But without those kinds of settled communities, whether they're labor for mines, labor for missions, labor for ranches around there, then in fact the Europeans by and large cannot survive in this area. It's going to be an area which is very resistant of imperial control for a very long time.
Throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries, the number of European settlers in Spanish America remains relatively small. The Spanish style of colonization is to exploit the existing native population, not establish large self-contained colonies.
Spanish colonization was very much directed by the crown, by the state, in terms of the people they sent over, obviously the military types, the missionaries. And from the very beginning, Spain envisioned a highly elaborate complicated bureaucratic state, governed from the top down. They were going to control everything. The fact that they were 3, 4, 5,000 miles away was a major complication, but it was one that they thought they could overcome. A lot of people begin to see in Spain, after its golden age, a kind of stagnation of all kinds, and that this affected its colonial control. There were competing interests, and there were also Indian revolts. This is usually not given much attention in American history textbooks, but in the 1680s there was the Pueblo Revolt, which was a significant revolt against Spanish control.
The Pueblo Indians lived in adobe brick villages, which the Spanish called pueblos. And these people didn't know they were all one people. They spoke different languages. They often fought with one another. And they didn't develop a common identity until they had a common set of problems imposed upon them by the intrusion of colonizing Spanish people. And so one of the ironies is that the Pueblo Indians developed improved capacity to communicate with one another where there had previously been linguistic barriers. And this ability to communicate with one another enabled the variety of Pueblo peoples to unite in a rebellion against Spanish rule in 1680. And this drove the Spanish out of New Mexico.
2 centuries of conflict leave their mark on both the Native American and Spanish cultures.
Indian peoples labor under a severe disadvantage, and that's their vulnerability to diseases that come in with the Europeans. For Indian peoples, these are what historians call virgin soil epidemics. They have no resistance, and so the death rates can be absolutely horrifying. And these death rates can reach, in some places, 60, 70, 80%. Now, disease itself will not give you that kind of death rate. It'll give you a lot. It'll give you 40 to 50%. But really, to reach the kinds of levels that are taking place here, very often what you need is social disruption. So Indian peoples not only get disease, but they're very often being victimized by slaving, raiding, warfare, which makes it impossible to feed, clothe, and house populations. Nobody's medicine is any good at this time.
Obviously, the diseases were carried by Indians who were fleeing the epidemics. But an additional way that they may have been spread was through the pigs that the Europeans brought with them. They multiplied over the land, and pigs are apparently biologically not dissimilar to human beings. And so some people think they may have been the disease reservoirs. However they were spread, it was devastating to Indian populations.
Not all the interaction between the 2 cultures is quite this disastrous to native populations.
So there's a substantial amount of time in which Indians do coexist independently alongside Europeans, and indeed many of the cultures of Indian people that we think of as quintessentially Indian couldn't develop until Europeans came because they depend on the horse. And so plains nomadism is just as much a product of this history of contact as anything that happens in the rest of the United States.
Indians increasingly developed a syncretic culture, which adopted elements of Hispanic culture, that adopted elements of Catholicism, of the agricultural practices that the Spanish introduced, and developed a pretty widespread rudimentary understanding of Spanish.
Intermarriage was frequent. Men living alone in a strange land craved companionship. Then, too, there was a desperate need for labor that only the native population could fill. But what of the quest of the Spaniards for new reaches?
Ultimately, they didn't find another Aztec empire, and they found Indians that had a capacity to defend themselves against the slaving expeditions by the Spaniards. So by about 1560 or so, they concluded that the rest of North America wasn't really worth the bother. And they had about all they could handle, and indeed they had very profitable colonies in Mexico and Peru. So they concentrated their resources there, and Spanish settlement concentrated in those places that were very prosperous. Why go live in Florida where there are not Indians who can be readily enslaved and there aren't gold and silver mines when you can settle, and quite happily and prosperously so, in Mexico or in Peru? So the Spanish Empire was immense, it was very rich, but it didn't really have the capacity for further expansion at the end of the 16th and early 17th century.
And yet the remnants of this collision between the Spanish and Native American cultures in the 15th and 16th centuries still exists today in parts of the United States and the nations of Central and South America. The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.